The stagecoach came into town trailing a long ribbon of dust that glowed gold beneath the sinking sun. It was the kind of arrival that usually drew curious eyes, especially in a frontier town where any newcomer meant new stories, new gossip, and sometimes new trouble. Children paused their games. Shopkeepers leaned in their doorways. Even the horses tied along the hitching posts lifted their heads as the wheels creaked to a stop. Everyone expected excitement. Instead, Silence stepped down from the coach. Her name was Clara Whitmore, though no one in town knew it yet. To them, she was simply the mail-order bride the rancher had been boasting about for weeks. He had told anyone who would listen that she was well-mannered, obedient, and grateful for a fresh start. Those words sounded respectable, reminded people of how marriage on the frontier often functioned less like romance and more like a contract for survival. Clara wore a plain blue dress, neat but worn at the hems as if it had traveled far. Her gloves were thin, and her hat was pulled low enough to shadow her eyes. She stepped down carefully, 1 foot at a time, as though the ground itself might shift beneath her. The journey west had been long, dusty, and uncertain, a reality many mail-order brides faced when leaving crowded eastern cities or struggling homesteads for a life they could only imagine through letters. Historically, these marriages were not uncommon in the American frontier. With men outnumbering women in many territories, agencies and newspaper ads offered women a chance at stability in exchange for marriage. Some found partnership and opportunity. Others found isolation. The system itself was neither purely hopeful nor purely cruel. It depended entirely on the character of the man waiting at the end of the road. And the man waiting for Clara was already there. He stood near the Tala coach with a straight posture and a hat pulled low. A wealthy rancher whose land stretched farther than most men could ride in a day. He didn't smile when he saw her. He simply reached out his hand, not as a greeting, but as a claim. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said flatly. Clara nodded. Her gloved hand trembled just slightly when it touched his. It was a movement so small that most people would have missed it. In a busy frontier town, subtle signs often went unnoticed because life demanded constant attention to survival. Crops, livestock, weather, trade. People learned to mind their own business, sometimes to a fault, but one man did notice. Across the street, near the horse trough, stood Tala, an Apache tracker who had come into town to trade horses and supplies. He was known for quiet observation more than conversation. Years of surviving harsh landscapes had taught him to read movement the way others read words. He saw what others overlooked: the stiffness in Clara's shoulders, the way she kept her sleeves pulled down despite the heat, and most of all, the way she flinched when the rancher's grip tightened around her wrist. It lasted only a second. Then she lowered her gaze and stood still again. But townspeople interpreted her silence as modesty. In that era, women were often expected to appear reserved, especially upon arrival in a new household. Cultural norms praised quiet obedience in wives, and many frontier communities mistook fear for politeness. Education about emotional well-being or personal safety was nearly non-existent, and legal protection for women, particularly in remote territories, was limited and inconsistently enforced. The rancher lifted Clara's small trunk from the coach without asking if she needed anything. He did not introduce her to anyone. He did not offer reassurance. He simply motioned toward his wagon as though she were another possession being transported. Home. Clara followed. She walked with measured steps, careful and controlled, as if every movement had been rehearsed long before she ever reached the frontier. Dust clung to the hem of her dress, and the wind tugged gently at her sleeves, yet she kept them firmly in place. The desert air was warm, but she did not roll them up like any traveler would after such a journey. Tala's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, in understanding. In many cultures, including Apache traditions, observation was a form of respect and protection. One did not interfere without reason. One watched, listened, and learned the truth of a situation before acting. It was a survival principle, especially in lands where impulsive decisions could bring unnecessary conflict. As the wagon began to roll away, Clara glanced back once. It was not a dramatic look, not a plea, not even a visible cry for help, just a quick, almost instinctive glance at the town she had never seen before, as if measuring whether it would become a place of safety or another place of endurance. Most people returned to their routines within moments. The blacksmith resumed hammering. The children went back to playing. The shopkeeper rearranged his goods. Life on the frontier moved forward quickly because it had to. But Tala did not move right away. He watched the wagon disappear down the long dirt road leading toward the ranchlands, the fading sunlight casting long shadows behind it. He had seen many arrivals in his lifetime: traders, settlers, soldiers, dreamers. Some arrived with hope. Some arrived with fear. Clara had arrived with silence, and in the quiet language of survival, silence often meant more than words ever could. Morning came early in the frontier, and on the ranch it came even earlier. Before the first full stretch of sunlight touched the dry hills, Clara was already awake. The rooster had barely crowed when she stepped out onto the porch, tying her apron with careful fingers. The land was wide and quiet, broken only by the creak of windmills and the low sounds of cattle shifting in their pens. It was beautiful in the way wild places often were, open, powerful, and indifferent to the struggles of those who lived upon it. For many mail-order brides, ranch life was not the gentle domestic future described in letters. Instead, it meant hard labor, isolation, and long days filled with chores essential to survival. Clara learned this quickly. There were floors to sweep, water to haul, meals to prepare, laundry to scrub, and animals to feed. The rancher spoke little, and when he did, his tone carried expectation rather than kindness. She did not complain. Not once. From a distance, her routine looked like quiet adjustment. That is what the townspeople would later say, that she was settling in, learning her role, and doing her duty. These phrases were common in frontier communities where endurance was seen as a virtue, especially for women. Education about emotional health, personal autonomy, or domestic protection was rarely discussed openly. Survival overshadowed everything else. Yet silence can hide many truths. Each time the rancher called her name, Clara responded immediately. Each time he entered a room, her posture straightened. When she walked, she kept her sleeves pulled low, even during the warmer hours of the day. It was a small detail, but small details often reveal larger realities. In harsh environments, people learn to hide discomfort the same way they hid fear, quietly, efficiently, and without drawing attention. Weeks passed before Clara made her first trip back into town. The wagon ride was long and mostly wordless. Dust clung to the wheels as they rolled over dry earth, and the town appeared again like a mirage of wooden storefronts and sun-faded signs. Clara carried a short list: flour, sugar, thread, and lamp oil. Basic supplies. Necessary supplies. The kind that marked a household being maintained, not a life being lived. Inside the general store, the air smelled of burlap sacks and ground coffee. A bell rang softly when she stepped in. The shopkeeper, an older man used to reading customers quickly, gave a polite nod. "Morning, ma'am," he said. Clara returned the nod and placed her list on the counter. Her voice, when it came, was soft and measured. "Just these, please." While the shopkeeper gathered the items, she reached into her pocket for coins. In that small motion, her sleeve shifted upward, only slightly, only for a second. But it was enough. Faint purple marks circled her wrist. Not fresh enough to be new, not faded enough to be old. Layered, repeated, hidden. The shopkeeper's eyes paused. He noticed. Then he looked back down at the flour sack as if he had seen nothing at all. This reaction was not uncommon in frontier towns. Communities were tightly knit but often cautious. Interfering in another household's affairs could lead to conflict, lost business, or even violence. Without strong legal systems in many remote territories, people relied on an unspoken rule: mind your business unless danger threatened the entire town. Unfortunately, this mindset sometimes allowed private suffering to remain invisible. Clara pulled her sleeve down quickly, her fingers smoothing the fabric with practiced calm. Her expression did not change. Years of endurance had taught her the skill of composure, a survival habit shared by many individuals living under pressure in isolated environments. Outside the store, a group of townsfolk chatted near the well. They saw her pass. They noticed her quiet nature, her lowered gaze, and her steady pace. To them, she seemed reserved, perhaps shy. In that era, a quiet wife was often praised as respectable. Cultural expectations encouraged women to be modest, obedient, and self-sacrificing, especially in new marriages. No one asked if she was well. No one asked if she was safe. Across the street, however, Tala stood near the hitching post, adjusting the saddle on a traded horse. His attention drifted toward the store just as Clara stepped out into the sunlight. The wind tugged lightly at her sleeve again, and this time he saw the marks. He did not stare. He simply observed. Where others saw a quiet bride, he saw patterns: tension in her shoulders, controlled movements, and the instinctive way she guarded her arms. Observation, in his experience, was not about judgment, but about understanding context. On the frontier, survival often depended on reading signs others ignored: a storm forming beyond the hills, a shift in animal behavior, or a silence that did not belong. Clara walked toward the wagon and placed the supplies carefully inside. The rancher watched from the driver's seat, his expression unreadable. When she climbed up, she kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, sleeves still pulled low despite the heat of midday. The wagon rolled away once more. Behind her, the town returned to its rhythm. The blacksmith hammered iron. Children laughed near the water trough. The shopkeeper stacked goods back onto the shelves, convincing himself that what he saw was none of his concern. This was how many frontier communities functioned, not out of cruelty, but out of caution and habit. Education about recognizing signs of harm, emotional distress, or coercion was nearly non-existent at the time. People believed that endurance was strength and that silence meant acceptance. But silence, in truth, can also be a shield. As the wagon disappeared into the open land, Tala remained where he stood, watching the dust trail fade into the horizon. He had seen suffering hidden before, among travelers, among warriors, among settlers, who believed survival meant never speaking of pain. The town had noticed the bride, but only one person had begun to truly see her. The third time, Tala visited the ranch. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant rain. He had come on business as he always did, trading horses, checking tack, and exchanging brief, practical words with the ranch hands. On the frontier, reasons mattered. One did not arrive uninvited without purpose. That was how trust was preserved and conflict avoided. The ranch house stood quiet against the wide land, its wooden walls sun-faded and stern. It was the kind of place built for function, not warmth. From a distance, it appeared orderly, even prosperous. Fences were straight. Tools were neatly hung. The cattle were well fed. To an outsider, it suggested discipline and success. But order, Tala knew, did not always mean kindness. Clara was at the well when he arrived, drawing water with steady effort. The rope creaked as she lifted the bucket, her movements controlled and precise. She did not look up immediately. Instead, she finished securing the bucket first. As though completing tasks in the correct order was safer than reacting suddenly. "Water's heavy today," Tala said calmly, keeping his tone neutral. She glanced at him then, surprised but composed. "Yes," she replied softly. "It always is." Her voice carried neither complaint nor ease. It was the voice of someone who measured every word before letting it leave her mouth. Tala stepped closer, careful to keep a respectful distance. In many frontier and indigenous traditions alike, direct confrontation without understanding could worsen a situation. Observation, patience, and timing were forms of wisdom, especially when dealing with people living under pressure. "I can carry it," he offered. Clara hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second, then handed him the bucket. As she did, the edge of the heavy metal handle brushed her wrist, and instinctively, she shifted her sleeve upward to avoid the friction. That was when he saw them fully, not just one bruise. Many faint, yellowing marks beneath newer purple ones. A pattern of pressure rather than accident. Not the scattered scrapes of ranch work, but the repeated grip of force. Old and new, layered like rings of a tree telling a hidden history. Tala did not react with shock. He did not gasp or accuse. Instead, he simply looked once, then lifted his eyes back to her face. His calm response was intentional. Sudden reactions could cause fear, and fear often closed doors that quiet concern could open. Clara noticed that he had seen. Her sleeve dropped immediately, her fingers smoothing the fabric with practiced speed. Her shoulders stiffened, and for a moment, the silence between them grew heavy, filled with unspoken understanding. On the frontier, silence was rarely empty. It was often protective. He placed the water bucket beside the porch and spoke gently. "Are you safe here?" The question was simple, not demanding, not loud, just clear. Clara froze. No one had asked her that before, not during the journey west, not in the letters that arranged her marriage, not in the town that watched her pass in quiet routine. Safety, for many women in isolated frontier homes, was assumed rather than examined. Educationally speaking, this reflects a broader historical reality. Remote settlements often lacked structured systems for welfare checks or domestic oversight. Privacy was valued, but it sometimes became a shield behind which harm remained unseen. Clara's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Instead, her gaze dropped to the ground. Her silence was not refusal, it was calculation. Speaking openly could bring consequences. Staying silent had, until now, ensured survival. Tala did not repeat the question. He waited. Patience was a skill learned from tracking and negotiation alike. In difficult situations, forcing answers often pushed truth further away. Creating a sense of control for the other person allowed trust to form naturally. After a long moment, Clara finally spoke. Though her voice was barely above a whisper, "I do my duties," she said. It was not an answer, but it revealed everything. The phrase reflected the cultural expectations placed on many frontier wives. That duty outweighed comfort. Obedience outweighed well-being, and endurance outweighed personal safety. Education on personal rights, emotional health, or marital protections was minimal in most territories. Many women believed hardship was simply part of their role. Tala nodded slowly. Duty should not leave marks. He replied quietly. The words were neither an accusation nor a command. They were an observation grounded in principle. In many survival cultures, strength was not measured by how much pain one endured, but by how wisely one responded to it. Clara looked up then, and for the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not relief, not yet, but recognition, the subtle awareness that someone had noticed without judgment. Inside the house, a door shut heavily. Her posture changed instantly, shoulders straightening, hands folding together as if preparing for inspection. The reaction was automatic, deeply conditioned. Trauma scholars often describe this as adaptive behavior, when individuals living in controlled or tense environments adjust their body language to anticipate authority. I should return to my work, she said quickly. Tala stepped back, giving her space rather than blocking her path. Respect, he understood, was essential. Help that removed agency was not help at all. As she walked toward the house, he spoke one last time. If you ever need to speak, he said calmly, you can do so without fear. She paused at the doorway, only for a second. Then she went inside. Tala remained by the porch, the wind moving softly across the plains. He did not act rashly. He did not confront the rancher. On the frontier, impulsive accusations could escalate into violence, and violence would not protect Clara. It might endanger her further. Instead, he relied on knowledge. He understood something important. Real intervention required truth, witnesses, and timing. Without those, even good intentions could fail. As he mounted his horse to leave, he looked once more at the quiet ranch house standing alone against the vast land. To the world it appeared stable and orderly, but he now knew what others did not. The bruises were real. The silence was intentional. And the truth, once seen, could no longer be unseen. Tala did not return to the ranch the next day, nor the day after. This was not hesitation. It was intention. On the frontier, acting too quickly could cause more harm than patience ever would. Many disputes in isolated territories escalated into violence simply because someone chose confrontation before understanding the full truth. Tala had lived long enough to know that force might satisfy anger, but it rarely protected the vulnerable in the long run. Instead of riding back toward the ranch, he rode into town. The morning sun stretched long shadows across the wooden boardwalk, as merchants opened their shops and the town slowly stirred to life. It looked like any other day, ordinary, steady, and predictable. Yet Tala carried with him the quiet weight of what he had seen. Bruises that spoke without words. Silence that concealed more than fear. A woman who answered questions with duty instead of truth. He tied his horse near the church first. The preacher, a middle-aged man known for mediating disputes rather than stirring them, stood outside sweeping dust from the steps. Frontier churches often served more than spiritual purposes. They were gathering places, schools, and informal centers of guidance in communities where formal institutions were scarce. You come early today, the preacher said, resting his broom. I come carefully, Tala replied. The preacher studied his expression and sensed the seriousness beneath his calm tone. What troubles the morning? Tala did not accuse the rancher. He did not dramatize the situation. Instead, he described what he had observed: the guarded sleeves, the layered bruises, the flinching grip, and the silence that followed a simple question about safety. This approach reflected an important educational principle. Presenting observable facts rather than emotional assumptions often leads to more responsible action. In frontier justice systems, where evidence could be scarce and accusations dangerous, careful reporting was often the difference between resolution and retaliation. The preacher listened quietly. After a pause, he said, "Have you spoken to her directly?" "I asked if she was safe," Tala answered. She spoke of duty. The preacher's brow furrowed. That single word carried meaning. In many marriages of the time, especially arranged or mail-order ones, women were culturally expected to endure hardship as part of their role. Educationally, historians note that legal awareness among frontier brides was often extremely limited. Many did not know that territorial laws, though imperfect, still granted them certain protections against severe mistreatment. Silence is not always agreement, the preacher said thoughtfully. Nor is it freedom, Tala replied. From the church, Tala went to the sheriff's office, a modest wooden building with a faded star nailed beside the door. The sheriff was not a man of many words, but he valued order and reputation within the town. On the frontier, law enforcement was often practical rather than formal. Sheriffs relied on witness accounts, community standing, and patterns of behavior more than written reports. "What brings you here?" the sheriff asked, leaning back in his chair. Tala again chose restraint. He explained what he had seen without exaggeration, emphasizing observation rather than accusation. He spoke of repeated marks, behavioral fear responses, and isolation at the ranch. He made no demands for arrest, no dramatic claims, only a request for awareness. This method was deeply educational in nature. Historically, responsible intervention in small communities often began with documentation and shared concern rather than direct confrontation. Acting without witnesses could be dismissed as rumor. Acting with quiet verification created accountability. The sheriff rubbed his chin. "The rancher is respected," he said slowly. "Pays his taxes. Keeps his land in order." "Order outside does not always mean peace inside," Tala replied calmly. The statement lingered in the room. Meanwhile, something else was unfolding at the ranch. Clara sat at the kitchen table with a piece of folded paper, the original marriage agreement she had carried west. Until recently, she had never read it closely. Many mail-order brides relied on trust or necessity rather than legal understanding, as education for women in poorer regions was often limited. But the preacher's assistant, during a quiet church visit days earlier, had told her something important. Territorial marriage laws did not erase a woman's basic rights. Even on the frontier, severe harm, coercion, or forced confinement could be questioned legally if witnesses and testimony existed. This knowledge was new to her, transformative. Educational empowerment, even in small forms, has historically played a critical role in changing the lives of vulnerable individuals. Understanding one's rights often shifts internal perception from helpless endurance to cautious agency. She traced the ink on the paper with trembling fingers. For the first time since arriving, she asked herself a different question, not, "How do I endure?" but "What am I allowed to change?" Back in town, the preacher and sheriff agreed on one thing. Reckless confrontation would only endanger Clara further. If the rancher felt publicly accused without structure, he might isolate her completely or relocate her beyond the town's reach, a common risk in remote settlements. So they chose a wiser course: observation, witnesses, timing. Over the following days, the town began to pay closer attention, though quietly. The shopkeeper noted her guarded movements. A ranch hand mentioned her long work hours without rest. The preacher ensured she was welcomed at church gatherings, offering her safe public spaces where she could be seen among others. This reflects another key educational lesson: community awareness can act as a protective layer in environments where formal systems are weak. When isolation decreases, vulnerability often decreases with it. Tala did not attempt to rescue her by force. He did not storm the ranch. He did not provoke a fight. He did not attempt to claim authority over her situation. Instead, he respected her autonomy, a deeply important ethical principle often overlooked in dramatic tales of rescue. True support empowers the individual rather than replacing one form of control with another. One afternoon, as Clara stood near the churchyard after a short service, the preacher spoke gently. "You are not without protection here," he told her. "Even in the frontier, the law listens when truth is spoken." She looked at him, uncertainty and fragile hope mixing in her expression. "I did not know that," she admitted quietly. And that moment, simple, quiet, and informed, marked the beginning of change. Because knowledge, unlike violence, does not burn quickly and disappear. It settles. It strengthens. It prepares. And for the first time since stepping off that dusty stagecoach, Clara was no longer completely alone in what she endured. The town gathering took place on a warm Saturday afternoon, just as it always did at the end of each trading week. Tables were set near the churchyard, children chased each other between wagons, and merchants displayed goods beneath simple canvas shades. From the outside, it looked like a celebration of ordinary frontier life, community, trade, and routine woven together in a place where survival depended on cooperation. But this gathering carried a quieter purpose. Word had not spread as gossip. It had moved carefully, respectfully, through conversation between trusted figures, the preacher, the sheriff, the shopkeeper, and a few ranch hands who had observed Clara's long hours and withdrawn manner. No accusations had been shouted. No public scenes had been staged. Instead, the town chose something more structured and responsible: presence. Educationally, this reflected a practical method used in many small frontier settlements. Without complex legal courts nearby, community accountability often functioned as the first layer of justice. When multiple witnesses observed patterns of harm or distress, their collective awareness carried weight that a single voice could not. Clara arrived beside the rancher, her hands folded neatly in front of her, sleeves still drawn low. She walked with the same composed steps she had practiced since the day she arrived, measured, careful, and quiet. To an untrained eye, she appeared calm, respectful, proper. But those who had begun to truly observe her noticed the details. The slight stiffness in her shoulders, the way her gaze avoided sudden movement, the pause before every spoken word. These were not signs of simple shyness. They were signs of prolonged tension. Tala stood near the edge of the gathering, not at the center. He did not seek attention or authority. His role had never been to lead the moment, only to ensure it happened with wisdom rather than chaos. Intervention without structure could lead to denial or retaliation, something that historical accounts of frontier disputes frequently warn against. The sheriff approached the rancher first. His tone was calm, professional, and steady. "I'd like a word, if you don't mind." The rancher frowned slightly but nodded. Reputation mattered in small towns, and refusing a sheriff's request in public could raise more suspicion than cooperation. They stepped aside near the well. Meanwhile, the preacher walked gently toward Clara. He did not corner her. He did not rush her. He simply stood beside her in open view, where she was neither isolated nor pressured. "You are among neighbors today," he said quietly. "You may speak freely here." Clara's fingers tightened around each other. For weeks, silence had been her shield. Silence had kept peace. Silence had reduced conflict. Silence had ensured survival. But silence had also hidden her pain, her fear, and her reality. Across the yard, the sheriff's voice remained low but firm as he spoke to the rancher. Witness accounts were mentioned carefully: her long work hours, her visible injuries, her isolation, and the repeated observations of guarded behavior. This was not emotional speculation. It was structured concern based on patterns. Historically, frontier justice often depended on credible observation rather than formal documentation. When multiple respected members of a community noticed the same warning signs, authorities were more likely to act responsibly rather than dismiss claims as rumor. The rancher's expression hardened. "She is my wife," he said flatly. "She is cared for and provided for." The sheriff did not argue loudly. Instead, he replied with measured clarity. "Provision does not excuse harm, and visible injuries raise lawful concern." That distinction was educational and important. Even in many territorial laws of the time, marriage did not grant absolute authority over another person's physical well-being. While enforcement varied, the legal concept that harm could not be justified by marital status did exist, though often underused due to lack of awareness. Back near the churchyard table, the preacher asked Clara a single question, the same one Tala had once asked, but now within a space of collective safety. "Are you well in your home?" Her breath caught. The sounds of the gathering seemed to fade. The laughter of children, the creak of wagon wheels, the quiet murmur of trade, all distant now compared to the weight of that moment. For the first time, she was not being asked in private, not in fear, not in isolation, but in open light, surrounded by witnesses and support. This environment mattered deeply from an educational perspective. Studies in social behavior, even when applied historically, show that individuals are more likely to speak truthfully when they feel both visible and protected within a community setting, rather than isolated behind closed doors. Clara's voice trembled when she finally spoke. "I perform my duties," she began, the familiar phrase slipping out by habit. Then she stopped. Her eyes lifted slowly, meeting the preacher's steady gaze, then the sheriff's presence across the yard, and finally the quiet figure of Tala standing at a respectful distance, not watching with pressure, but with calm assurance. Something changed inside her. "I am not treated with kindness," she said softly. The words were small, but their impact was not. The gathering grew quieter, not in shock, but in attentive respect. No one interrupted. No one dismissed her. That silence, unlike the earlier silence of avoidance, was intentional listening. The sheriff turned back toward her, maintaining a composed tone. "Have you been harmed?" Her hands trembled, but she did not hide them this time. Slowly, deliberately, she rolled back her sleeve. The bruises, once hidden beneath fabric and silence, were now visible in daylight. Layered, clear, undeniable. This act of revealing evidence publicly was significant in frontier accountability practices. Visible proof, combined with testimony, often served as the strongest form of validation in communities where written reports and medical records were rare. "I feared speaking," Clara admitted, her voice steadier now despite the emotion. "I believed endurance was expected of me." The preacher shook his head gently. "Endurance is not the same as suffering in silence." The rancher protested, but his voice carried less certainty now. Reputation, once his shield, began to weaken under collective observation. The sheriff, supported by multiple witnesses and Clara's own testimony, informed him that the matter would be formally investigated under territorial law and that Clara's safety would be prioritized. Most importantly, she was not returned to isolation. Instead, she remained in town that evening, under community protection, a historically grounded approach used in many settlements when disputes within households raised concern for personal safety. As the sun dipped low again, casting warm light over the town, Clara stood near the church steps. Her sleeves no longer pulled tightly down. For the first time since arriving, her posture was different, still cautious, still gentle, but no longer silent. The weeks that followed did not move quickly, but they moved steadily, and that difference mattered. Frontier justice was rarely dramatic. There were no grand courtrooms nearby, No long speeches before large juries. Instead, decisions were shaped through testimony, witness accounts, and the steady involvement of trusted community figures. The sheriff documented Clara's visible injuries and the statements given during the gathering. The preacher and shopkeeper provided their observations, while a ranch hand confirmed her long hours of labor and isolation. Education. Truth and patience worked together. The rancher, once confident in his reputation, found that reputation alone could not outweigh consistent evidence. Territorial law, though imperfect and unevenly enforced, still recognized harm when supported by testimony and witnesses. He was formally warned, investigated, and socially distanced by the town, a powerful consequence in a small frontier settlement where trust and standing determined influence. More importantly, Clara was not sent back to the ranch. Instead, she was offered temporary lodging in a small room behind the church schoolhouse. It was modest, but it was safe. Safety, she soon realized, was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, predictable, gentle, no sudden commands, no tightened grip on her wrist, no need to measure every movement. For the first few days, she woke before sunrise out of habit, her body still trained by weeks of rigid routine. Yet each morning she noticed something new. No footsteps pacing outside her door, no harsh voice calling her name, no fear waiting behind ordinary tasks. This shift reflects an important educational truth about recovery from prolonged stress. When individuals leave controlling environments, their bodies and minds often need time to relearn what safety feels like. Healing is rarely immediate. It is gradual and built through consistent, stable experiences. One afternoon, the preacher's assistant handed Clara a small book. "You mentioned you never had much schooling," she said kindly. "You may begin here, if you wish." Clara held the book carefully, as though it were something fragile and unfamiliar. Reading had never been a regular part of her life. Like many women from struggling backgrounds in that era, her education had been limited by circumstance rather than ability. On the frontier, literacy was more than a skill. It was a path to independence. Legal awareness and self-confidence dotted first. The letters blurred together, but day by day, word by word, they began to make sense. She started helping at the schoolhouse in small ways, sweeping floors, organizing slates, assisting children with simple tasks. The work was steady but not oppressive, structured but not demanding. For the first time, her labor was appreciated rather than expected as silent duty. Meanwhile, Tala continued his visits to town, though never intrusively. He did not present himself as a rescuer or guardian. He greeted her the same way he greeted others, with calm respect and patience. This distinction mattered deeply. True support, especially in recovery, respects autonomy rather than replacing one form of control with another. One evening, as the sun stretched across the plains in soft shades of amber, Clara sat outside the schoolhouse with a notebook resting on her lap. She practiced writing her name slowly, each letter deliberate. Kalauraura. She paused, studying it with quiet wonder. "I used to think my life was already decided," she said softly when Tala approached, carrying a bundle of supplies for the school. He sat a respectful distance away before replying. "Paths can change when knowledge walks beside courage." She looked toward the horizon, where the open land no longer felt like a prison of distance but a space of possibility. "I did not know I had rights," she admitted. "I believed endurance was the only choice." "That belief kept you alive," Tala said gently. "But knowledge helped you live." His words reflected a powerful educational theme. Awareness of legal and personal rights has historically been one of the most transformative tools for vulnerable individuals. Many mail-order brides and frontier women endured hardship not because they lacked strength, but because they lacked information about the protections and options available to them. Seasons shifted. Clara's reading improved. Her posture softened. She began speaking more during community gatherings, sometimes even smiling when children asked her to help with their lessons. The town, once a place of quiet observation, became a place of quiet belonging. No one rushed her healing. No one demanded gratitude. No one defined her by her past. Months later, on a clear morning beneath a wide blue sky, the sheriff formally confirmed that Clara was free from the marital contract due to documented mistreatment and her own testimony. Though such rulings were not always common in remote territories, community-supported evidence made the decision possible. It was a reminder that even in harsh eras, justice could exist when truth was acknowledged collectively. The day she received the notice, she did not cry. Instead, she breathed deeply, a slow, steady breath that carried relief rather than fear. That evening, the town gathered again, but this time not in concern. It was a simple meal near the churchyard, filled with laughter, shared bread, and stories of trade and travel. Clara sat among them, sleeves rolled naturally in the warm air. No longer hiding her arms, no longer guarding every motion. Tala handed her a small wrapped parcel. Inside was a simple writing journal. "For your own story," he said. She smiled, not the cautious smile of politeness, but a genuine one shaped by safety and self-worth. "I think," she replied softly, "I will write a future instead." Their bond grew slowly after that, not from rescue, but from mutual respect and shared quiet understanding. He never claimed her, never spoke as if she owed him anything. He simply walked beside her as she rebuilt her life through learning, community, and choice. And one day, beneath the same open sky that had once witnessed her silent arrival, Clara made a decision freely, not out of fear, not out of survival, but out of trust. The frontier wind moved gently across the plains as she stood outside the schoolhouse, watching children read aloud from their lessons. Her hands were steady now. Her voice, when she spoke, carried confidence. Her life had not been saved by violence. It had been changed by awareness, protected by community, strengthened by education.